Have you ever wondered why being yourself feels so difficult? We talk about freedom all the time. We believe we have choices. We say, this is how I feel, this is what I think, this is how I want to live. But we rarely stop to ask where this self came from. Who decided what this me is? When you were born, you had no name. You had no language, you had no fears, you had no sense of guilt. You did not even have the idea of I. And yet, very quickly, the world began to tell you who you are. This is good, this is bad. Fear, this desire that be this, do not be that. And you learned, because if you did not learn, you would not survive. Many people believe that power controls us through force, through laws, through violence. But history shows something far more effective. Humans are not ruled primarily by force. They are ruled by meaning. When a person believes they understand why they exist, they begin to live exactly as they are told. This video does not accuse you. It does not judge you. It asks only one question. Are you truly yourself, or are you living inside an identity that was given to you? We ask this question far too late, usually after we have already adapted, after we have accepted fear, after we have learned our roles. Throughout history, people believed they were free while obeying silently, while defending systems that harmed them. This feels like a contradiction, but it is one of the oldest mechanisms of human existence. Because for humans, something is often more important than freedom, belonging to belong. People give up doubt, they give up questions. Sometimes they even give up their own feelings. The earliest humans did not see themselves as individuals. They simply existed, not good, not evil, not sinful, not pure. Those ideas came later as populations grew, as societies formed, as order became necessary. And to create order, stories were born. Myths, gods, moral rules, taboos. These stories were not created to protect humans. They were created to direct them. Over time, fear moved from the outside world into the human mind. Guilt, conscience, shame, chains were no longer needed. Humans began to police themselves. Today, we use different words: identity, personality, ideology, normality. But the mechanism is the same. This video will not tell you what to believe. It will not tell you how to live. It will not decide who is right or wrong. It wants only to pause you for a moment and ask, if everything you were taught were stripped away, if fear were removed, if roles disappeared, who would you be? This question is dangerous. It has always been dangerous. Because when this question is asked, systems begin to shake. That is why it is rarely encouraged. But perhaps human existence was never about finding answers. Perhaps it was always about daring to ask the first real question. If every role were taken from you, who would remain? If the titles disappeared, the labels fell away, and the expectations dissolved, what would be left when there was no audience watching and no system rewarding your behavior? We spend our lives performing without realizing it. Child, student, worker, citizen, parent, believer, rebel, success, failure, strong, weak. These roles feel natural because we have lived inside them for so long, but none of them were present at your beginning. They were handed to you slowly, gently, so gently that resistance felt unnecessary. When you obey a role long enough, it stops feeling imposed and starts feeling like identity. But identity formed this way is not discovered, it is absorbed. And absorption is quiet. You are praised when you perform correctly. You are corrected when you deviate. Over time, the correction becomes internal. You begin to monitor yourself. You anticipate judgment before it arrives. You silence thoughts before anyone hears them, and you call this self-control. But what if self-control is simply control that has moved inside? What if the voice you believe is your conscience is actually a chorus of borrowed expectations speaking through you? This is why the question is so unsettling, because when the roles are removed, there is no script. Without a script, there is no clear next action, and without action, there is silence. Most people fear this silence more than oppression, because silence offers no instructions. It does not tell you who to be useful to. It does not tell you how to belong. In that silence, you are not needed and not approved. You simply are, and for a mind trained to measure worth through function, this feels like disappearance. That is why roles are defended even when they suffocate. They give shape to existence, they explain suffering, they justify obedience. A role tells you why your pain makes sense, why your fear is reasonable, why your sacrifice is noble. Remove the role and pain becomes meaningless. Fear becomes naked. Sacrifice becomes a question. And questions are dangerous because they dissolve certainty. When someone asks who they are without roles, they are no longer predictable. Systems rely on predictability. Predictable people can be guided, organized, replaced. A person who no longer identifies with their role cannot be easily managed because they no longer fear losing it. This is why identity is protected so fiercely by societies and punished when it drifts too far. Identity keeps people anchored to expectation. It convinces them that leaving would mean losing themselves. But what if the opposite is true? What if what you call yourself is only what you were taught to protect? And what remains when nothing is left to defend is not emptiness but presence, not a character but awareness, not a role but a living consciousness, observing itself without instruction. If every role were taken from you and nothing told you who to be, the question is not who would you become. The real question is, would you be able to stay with what remains without immediately searching for a new mask? This question is asked, systems begin to shake. That is why it is rarely encouraged. But perhaps human existence was never about finding answers. Perhaps it was always about daring to ask the first real question. Before identity existed, before names, before roles, before moral judgments, there was only existence. The earliest humans did not wake up asking who they were or what they were meant to become. They did not carry an internal story about themselves. There was no concept of success, failure, virtue, sin, purpose, or destiny. There was only hunger, cold, movement, danger, warmth, sound, and silence. Life was not interpreted, it was experienced. The human did not stand apart from the world observing it. The human was inside it, reacting to it, breathing with it. Fear existed, but it was immediate, not psychological. It was the fear of a shadow moving in the grass, the fear of hunger, the fear of isolation, not the fear of judgment or meaning. There was no inner courtroom where actions were evaluated as good or bad. There was only consequence: live or die, eat or starve, stay or flee. In this state, there was no self-narrative, no inner voice explaining existence, no identity to protect, no role to maintain. The individual mattered only insofar as the group survived, and even the group was not an abstract idea. It was simply proximity, shared warmth, shared danger, shared movement. Early humans did not think in terms of I am this or I am not that. Those distinctions had no use. There was no reputation, no status, no imagined future self. The present moment was not something to escape from. It was all that existed. This is what we mean by pure existence. Not innocence, not wisdom, but absence of abstraction. The human mind had not yet turned inward to monitor itself. There was awareness, but not self-awareness. Consciousness without commentary, being without identity. This state did not feel empty. It felt complete because nothing was missing. Only when humans began to settle, only when survival required coordination, over time did abstraction appear, when memory began to shape behavior, when future planning became necessary, when groups grew large enough that trust could not rely solely on familiarity. Then something new emerged: the need for consistency. the need for predictability, the need for rules. And with rules came identity, because once behavior must be regulated, behavior must be named. And once behavior is named, the person performing it becomes something: a hunter, a protector, a threat, a leader, a follower. This was the moment the self began to form, not as discovery but as function. Identity was not born from curiosity, it was born from necessity. The group needed to know who could be trusted, who could be relied on, who must be watched. And so humans slowly learned to see themselves from the outside, to imagine how they appeared, to remember how they were treated, to adjust accordingly. This was the beginning of the inner observer, the moment humans learned to look at themselves as objects, the moment existence stopped being enough, and something had to be explained, justified, repeated, preserved. What we lost in that transition was not freedom in a modern sense, but immediacy. We lost the ability to exist without explanation, to act without justification, to be without definition. And every system that followed religion, law, morality, culture would build upon this first separation. The moment the humans stopped simply existing and began to ask what they were allowed to be. But humans could not live alone, and living together always comes with a cost. Survival in isolation was short, fragile, and uncertain, while survival in groups offered warmth, protection, shared labor, and continuity. Yet the moment humans gathered, something changed. Existence was no longer only about reacting to nature. It became about managing each other, to live together. Humans needed more than instinct. They needed coordination, and coordination required agreement. Agreement required rules, and rules required compliance. This was the first price of togetherness. At first, the cost was small, almost invisible, a shared rhythm, a repeated behavior, a trusted pattern. But as groups grew, the cost increased. Familiarity was replaced by expectation. Trust was replaced by structure, and structure demanded consistency. When many people depend on one another, unpredictability becomes dangerous. The group begins to favor those who behave reliably, those who follow patterns, those who do not disrupt flow. Slowly, survival stops being only about strength or awareness and becomes about acceptance. To belong is to be tolerated. To be tolerated is to behave correctly. And correctness is defined not by nature but by the group. This is where the individual begins to shrink. Not physically, but internally. The human learns to suppress impulses that do not fit. The human learns to delay reactions. The human learns to watch themselves through the eyes of others. This self-observation is praised. It is called maturity, responsibility, civilization. But it is also the moment when existence gains weight, when actions are no longer just actions, but signals. When behavior becomes meaning, and meaning becomes judgment. Living together creates safety, but it also creates comparison. Comparison creates hierarchy, and hierarchy creates fear. Fear not of death, but of exclusion. Exclusion in early societies often meant death, which is why social rejection became one of the deepest human anxieties. To avoid it, humans learned to adjust themselves. They learned to soften instincts, sharpen obedience, and trade authenticity for belonging. This was not a conscious decision, it was an adaptation. The group did not say, "Surrender yourself." It said, "Survive with us." And survival required conformity. Thus, the cost of togetherness was not paid once. It was paid continuously in silence, in compromise, in the slow shaping of the self. The human did not lose something suddenly. It gave something up gradually, until one day identity felt natural and pure existence felt distant, almost unreal. And from that moment forward, every system, every myth, every law, every moral code would build upon this exchange. Safety in return for self and belonging in return for obedience. Humans learned who they were through stories, before laws, before written rules. Before institutions, there were narratives told around fire and darkness. Stories explained what could not yet be controlled. They gave shape to fear. They turned chaos into sequence. And in doing so, they gave humans their first identity. A story does not only describe the world, it places the listener inside it. It assigns meaning. It tells you who matters, who is dangerous, who is rewarded, and who is punished. When early humans listened to these stories, they were not entertained. They were instructed. The hero showed what was acceptable. The monster showed what was forbidden. The gods showed what must not be questioned. Through repetition, these narratives became memory, and memory became expectation. Humans began to see themselves not as they were, but as the stories described them. Brave, coward, loyal, cursed, chosen, guilty. Worthy identity did not emerge from self-reflection. It emerged from narrative alignment. To belong was to recognize yourself inside the story, and to fall outside the story was to risk isolation. Stories created continuity across generations. They allowed the dead to speak to the living. They carried fear forward without requiring experience. You no longer had to face danger to fear it. You only had to hear about it. And so fear became inherited, not learned. Meaning became fixed rather than discovered. This was efficient. It reduced uncertainty. It synchronized behavior, but it also narrowed possibility. Once a story explains the world, it leaves little room to question it. Once a role is embedded in myth, stepping outside it feels unnatural, even immoral. This is how stories became invisible structures. They did not force obedience. They made obedience feel right. Humans did not obey because they were weak. They obeyed because the story made obedience meaningful. Sacrifice became noble, suffering became purposeful. Silence became virtue, and rebellion became chaos. The most powerful stories were not those that described reality, but those that justified it. Over time, humans forgot that these narratives were created. They began to experience them as truth, as order, as the way things are. And once a story is mistaken for reality, identity becomes fixed. The human no longer asks, "Who am I?" They ask, "Am I playing my part correctly?" And this was the moment when meaning replaced existence. When living was no longer enough, it had to make sense according to the story. Myths were not created to protect humans. They were created to guide them. At a glance, myths appear comforting. They explain storms, hunger, death, suffering, and uncertainty. They offer reasons where none are visible. But beneath that surface, myths serve a quieter function. They organize behavior. A myth does not simply tell you what happened. It tells you what to expect, what to fear, and how to act. When a story explains why lightning strikes, or why misfortune occurs, it also explains who is at fault and what must be done to avoid it. In this way, myths transform randomness into responsibility. They shift danger from the outside world into human behavior. If something goes wrong, it is no longer nature, it is disobedience. Improper belief, broken ritual, forgotten rule. This is not protection, this is direction. Early societies did not need myths to make life safer. Life was already dangerous. What they needed was predictability. Predictability makes groups stable. Stable groups survive longer, and myths provided that stability by shaping thought before action. Myths told people where they stood in the cosmic order, who was above them, who was below them, and why that order must not be disturbed. A god watching from above is not merely a divine figure, it is a behavioral anchor. It turns uncertainty into surveillance. Even when no one is present, the myth remains watching. Guiding, correcting mythic punishment rarely comes immediately. It comes later invisibly, which makes it more powerful. Fear no longer requires proof, it only requires belief. Through myth, obedience becomes internal. People do not follow rules because someone enforces them. They follow them because the story says, this is how the world works. In this way, myths reduce resistance. They do not demand submission. They make submission feel natural, necessary, moral. This is why myths endure long after their original conditions disappear. The environment changes, the dangers change, but the narrative remains because it has outlived its function as explanation and taken on a new function as control. Humans do not question myths easily because myths do not present themselves as commands. They present themselves as truth, and truth does not feel optional. When a myth defines what is good and evil, it also defines what kind of person you are allowed to be. Stepping outside the myth does not feel like curiosity. It feels like betrayal. This is how myths shape identity without force. They do not protect humans from chaos. They protect order from humans. And once a society internalizes its myths, it no longer needs constant enforcement. The story itself does the work, guiding behavior, defining limits, and quietly reminding each individual where they belong. Religion and morality marked a turning point in human control because for the first time, power no longer needed to stand outside the individual. Watching eyes no longer had to be human. The authority moved inward. Early belief systems did not only explain the universe, they reorganized the inner world of the believer. They introduced an invisible observer, one that could not be escaped. A God that sees without being seen. A judgment that arrives even when no one else is present. This changed everything. Before this, fear was external. It came from animals, nature, enemies, hunger. With religion, fear became psychological. It followed the individual into solitude, into thought, into intention. Actions were no longer judged only by outcome, but by motive. Desire itself became suspect, thought became accountable. Morality transformed behavior into identity. You were no longer someone who did something wrong. You were someone who was wrong. Sin was not a mistake, it was a condition. This was the birth of internal surveillance. Once morality is internalized, control becomes effortless. No guard is needed, no threat must be spoken. The individual monitors themselves. They suppress impulses before they appear. They feel guilt without punishment, shame without accusation, obedience without command. This feels like virtue. It is taught as goodness, but functionally it is self-regulation at its most efficient. Religion did not simply say, do not act. It said, do not think, do not desire, do not question. This made control permanent because it operated even in silence, even in dreams, even in doubt. The individual became both prisoner and guard. Morality framed this process as liberation. To obey was to be pure. To submit was to be righteous. To conform was to be good. This removed resistance because resisting control now felt immoral. Disobedience was no longer rebellion, it was corruption. Questioning was no longer curiosity, it was danger. Communities reinforced this by rewarding visible virtue and punishing deviation, not always through violence, but through exclusion, suspicion, and fear of eternal consequence. The most powerful threat was not death, it was meaninglessness. The fear that without obedience life would lose purpose. Religion filled that void. It gave suffering an explanation. Pain became a test. Sacrifice became proof. Endurance became holiness. This made hardship bearable, but it also made it acceptable. Systems no longer had to justify themselves. Because morality justified them, God was not only above society, God was embedded within it and eventually within the self. At this stage, power achieved its most refined form. People no longer asked who controls them. They asked whether they were worthy, and in doing so, they accepted control as identity. This is why moral systems endure long after belief fades. Even when gods disappear, the internal structure remains. Guilt survives. Shame survives. Fear of judgment survives. The language changes, but the mechanism does not. The human continues to police itself. Because once control becomes conscience, it no longer feels like control. It feels like who you are. If you obey, even when there is no punishment, is that freedom? Or is it the most complete form of control? Punishment is obvious. It creates resistance. Even fear leaves room for awareness. But obedience without threat is silent. It feels voluntary. It feels chosen. When no one is watching and you still comply, you begin to believe the decision is yours. This is where control becomes invisible. Freedom is often defined as the absence of force. But force is only the crudest form of power. The most effective systems do not rely on fear of punishment. They rely on fear of deviation. When a person obeys without being threatened, it means the rules have moved inside them. They no longer ask, what will happen if I disobey? They ask, what kind of person would disobey? This shift is crucial because now obedience is no longer an action. It is an identity, and identities defend themselves more fiercely than laws. Ever since humans learned to associate obedience with goodness, conformity with morality, and submission with virtue, disobedience began to feel wrong even before consequences appeared. The body reacts first. Unease, guilt, anxiety, a sense of danger without a visible source. These sensations are not natural instincts. They are learned responses conditioned over generations. They signal not physical threat but social risk. The possibility of exclusion, loss of meaning, loss of belonging. When obedience feels effortless, it is often because resistance has already been removed. At the psychological level, the mind no longer explores forbidden paths because it has been trained to see them as unthinkable. This is why systems prefer internalized obedience over enforced obedience. Enforced obedience produces compliance. Internalized obedience produces loyalty. Loyalty is self-sustaining. It does not require surveillance. It does not require explanation. It does not require violence. People defend the rules even when the rules harm them, because abandoning the rules would mean abandoning the self they have built around them. At that point, obedience is no longer a response to power. It is power expressing itself through the individual. Freedom cannot exist where choice is never questioned, and choice cannot be questioned where obedience feels moral. If you obey without punishment, the question is not whether you are free. The question is whether freedom was ever presented to you as an option, or whether what you call freedom is simply obedience without chains. If you obey, even when there is no punishment, is that freedom? Or is it the most complete form of control? Punishment is obvious. It creates resistance. Even fear leaves room for awareness. But obedience without threat is silent. It feels voluntary. It feels chosen. When no one is watching and you still comply, you begin to believe the decision is yours. This is where control becomes invisible. Freedom is often defined as the absence of force, but force is only the crudest form of power. The most effective systems do not rely on fear of punishment. They rely on fear of deviation. When a person obeys without being threatened, it means the rules have moved inside them. They no longer ask, what will happen if I disobey? They ask, what kind of person would disobey? This shift is crucial because now obedience is no longer an action. It is an identity, and identities defend themselves more fiercely than laws. Ever since humans learned to associate obedience with goodness, conformity with morality, and submission with virtue, disobedience began to feel wrong even before consequences appeared. The body reacts first. Unease, guilt, anxiety, a sense of danger without a visible source. These sensations are not natural instincts. They are learned responses conditioned over generations. They signal not physical threat but social risk. The possibility of exclusion, loss of meaning, loss of belonging. When obedience feels effortless, it is often because resistance has already been removed at the psychological level. The mind no longer explores forbidden paths because it has been trained to see them as unthinkable. This is why systems prefer internalized obedience over enforced obedience. Enforced obedience produces compliance. Internalized obedience produces loyalty. Loyalty is self-sustaining. It does not require surveillance. It does not require explanation. It does not require violence. People defend the rules even when the rules harm them, because abandoning the rules would mean abandoning the self they have built around them. At that point, obedience is no longer a response to power. It is power expressing itself through the individual. Freedom cannot exist where choice is never questioned, and choice cannot be questioned where obedience feels moral. If you obey without punishment, the question is not whether you are free. The question is whether freedom was ever presented to you as an option, or whether what you call freedom is simply obedience without chains. Power does not begin by commanding behavior. It begins by defining identity. Long before authority tells people what to do, it tells them who they are, because behavior can be resisted, but identity is defended. When a person believes something is part of who they are, they will protect it even at their own expense. This is why the most successful forms of power do not rule through constant force. They rule through roles. Empire after empire understood this intuitively. A population does not need to be watched closely if each individual knows their place. Soldier, farmer, priest, mother, citizen, subject. Each role comes with expectations, limits, and rewards. And once a role is internalized, stepping outside, it feels like betrayal. Not rebellion. Identity turns obedience into duty and duty into virtue. Power benefits from this transformation because it no longer has to justify itself. The system does not say obey. It says be who you are, and who you are is defined in a way that serves the system. Over time, people stop experiencing power as external pressure. It becomes self-expression. A soldier dies not because he is ordered to, but because it is who he is. A subject submits not because they are weak, but because loyalty defines them. Even resistance is often allowed as long as it takes a recognizable form. A controlled opposition, a permitted rebellion that still affirms the structure. Identity narrows imagination. It sets the boundaries of what feels possible. When power controls identity, it controls the range of thought before thought even forms. This is why changing laws rarely changes systems. If identity remains intact, behavior will return to its expected shape. Power understands this, which is why identity is protected so aggressively by culture, education, tradition, and morality. From childhood, people are taught not only how to act, but how to see themselves. Pride, shame, honor, worth all become attached to roles. And once self-worth depends on a role, the role becomes sacred. Questioning it feels like self-destruction. This is how power survives generations. It does not rely on memory of oppression. It relies on continuity of identity. People inherit roles before they inherit land or language. And because identity feels personal, its political function is rarely noticed. Individuals believe they are choosing when they are actually maintaining. When identity and power merge, resistance becomes psychologically costly. To resist is to risk isolation, meaninglessness, and loss of self. This is why power fears not rebellion but detachment. A person who no longer identifies with the role assigned to them is unpredictable. They no longer obey out of loyalty. They no longer comply out of pride. They are not easily motivated by shame or reward. Such a person is difficult to govern because power has nothing to hold on to. Identity is the handle of control, and when the handle disappears, force must return. This is why systems invest so deeply in shaping identity, because as long as people ask, "Who am I?" within this structure, power remains stable. The real threat emerges only when the question changes, when someone asks, "Who am I?" without it. Power fears free humans because free humans are unpredictable. A free human does not respond automatically. They pause, they question, they hesitate. And hesitation is dangerous to any system built on continuity. Power depends on repetition, on reliability, on behavior that can be anticipated in advance. A free human disrupts this because freedom introduces uncertainty. You cannot fully predict what a person will do when their actions are not anchored to fear, reward, or identity. This is why power does not primarily seek to crush freedom, it seeks to prevent it from forming. Instead, it shapes people long before freedom becomes a possibility. A shaped human is far more useful than a controlled one, because control invites resistance, but formation feels natural. When a person has been formed, they do not feel restrained. They feel complete. They believe they are acting according to their nature. Their choices feel authentic even when they are limited. This is the genius of power. Formed humans do not need to be watched closely. They regulate themselves. They defend the structures that define them because those structures give them identity, purpose, and belonging. Power does not fear such people. It relies on them. They are predictable, loyal, replaceable. Most importantly, they are convinced that obedience is a personal virtue, not a political condition. A free human asks, "Why?" A formed human asks, "How well am I performing?" A free human sees roles as temporary. A formed human sees roles as self-power. Fears the first because they expose alternatives. They imagine otherwise, they reveal that the system is not inevitable, only familiar, but familiarity is not truth. It is repetition mistaken for reality. Formed humans, on the other hand, stabilize power. They pass it on, they teach it, they normalize it. Without being asked, they become living extensions of the system. This is why education, culture, morality, and identity are more important to power than violence. Violence is visible and expensive. Formation is subtle and permanent. A free human must be silenced. A formed human will silence themselves, and often silence others in the name of order, virtue, or normality. Power survives not because people are weak, but because they are shaped to feel whole inside their limits. The greatest threat to power is not rebellion. It is the quiet moment when a person realizes that what they have been protecting was never their self, but a shape given to them. And once that realization occurs, power loses its grip because it no longer knows who it is dealing with, and that uncertainty is what power fears most. The modern world does not present itself as a place of control. It presents itself as a place of choice. Freedom is everywhere in language, in advertising, in politics, in identity. You are told you can be anything, choose anything, become anything. Yet this abundance of choice hides a quieter truth. The boundaries are already drawn. The options are curated. The paths are pre-selected. Modern control does not tell you what to do. It tells you what is available, and what is available slowly defines what feels possible. Unlike older systems, the modern world does not demand obedience. It rewards alignment. You are not punished for disobedience. You are ignored, excluded, rendered invisible. This is far more effective because pain creates resistance, but irrelevance creates conformity. People adjust themselves not to avoid suffering, but to remain seen, heard, acknowledged. The fear is no longer of violence, but of disappearance. In this system, freedom is framed as personal expression. You choose your style, your opinions, your identity. But these choices exist within narrow, acceptable ranges. They differ in appearance, not in structure. This creates the illusion of individuality while preserving uniformity. People feel unique while behaving identically. The system does not need to suppress difference, it monetizes it. Identity becomes a product, belief becomes branding. Even rebellion is packaged, shaped, and sold back as lifestyle. In this way, resistance loses its threat because it no longer points outside the system. It becomes another variation within it. Modern power does not silence dissent. It absorbs it and neutralizes it by turning it into content. The individual believes they are choosing, while the system benefits from every choice. The more passionately someone identifies, the easier they are to predict. The more clearly someone defines themselves, the easier they are to target. Freedom becomes performance, identity becomes display, and the self becomes a profile to be optimized. People begin to curate themselves as if they are being watched even when they are alone. This is not paranoia, it is conditioning. The invisible audience is always present. Algorithms, metrics, approval signals, these replace gods and kings as the new observers. Judgment no longer comes from above. It comes from everywhere at once, quantified, measured, compared. In such an environment, the idea of freedom shifts. Freedom no longer means the ability to question the structure. It means the ability to choose comfortably within it. As long as discomfort can be avoided, the system remains unchallenged. Because true freedom is disruptive, it creates friction. It introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens efficiency. The modern world values efficiency above all else. Efficient consumption, efficient behavior, efficient identity. Anything that cannot be measured, managed, or predicted is seen as a problem. This is why slowness feels rebellious, silence feels suspicious, detachment feels dangerous. A person who does not constantly express, does not constantly choose, does not constantly perform, becomes difficult to place, and what cannot be placed cannot be controlled. This is why the illusion of freedom is maintained so carefully. People are busy choosing, so they never ask who decided the options. People are busy expressing, so they never ask who benefits from the expression. People are busy becoming, so they never ask what they have lost. In the modern world, chains are unnecessary because the illusion of freedom is lighter, easier, and far more effective. And as long as people feel free, they will defend the system that defines freedom for them, without ever realizing that what they are defending is not freedom itself, but the boundaries placed around it. At the core of modern control lies one of the oldest human fears, the fear of being cast out. Long before prisons, laws, or surveillance existed, exclusion was a death sentence. To be separated from the group meant exposure, hunger, vulnerability, and disappearance. That ancient memory never left the human nervous system. It adapted, it softened, but it remained. Today, the fear of being expelled from the group no longer threatens physical survival, but it threatens something equally powerful: identity, meaning, and belonging. Humans are social not only by habit but by biology. The brain is wired to seek approval, to mirror behavior, to avoid standing alone. This is why the need to be normal is so persistent. Normality feels safe because it promises invisibility. To be normal is to blend, to avoid attention, to escape judgment. In modern societies, normality is not defined clearly. It shifts constantly, but people sense it intuitively. They feel when an opinion goes too far, when a question lingers too long, when curiosity becomes uncomfortable. And before any authority intervenes, the individual intervenes in themselves. They soften their words, they change tone, they remain silent. This is self-censorship disguised as maturity. The system does not need to silence people directly, because the group does it for them. The questioner becomes unsettling not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt shared comfort. A question introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens cohesion. Groups respond to this instinctively. They mock, marginalize, label, or ignore. Those reactions are not always malicious. They are protective. The group protects its narrative because the narrative holds it together. This is why those who ask fundamental questions are rarely debated. They are managed. Their credibility is questioned, their motives are doubted, their presence becomes inconvenient. Silence is not enforced through violence. It is enforced through discomfort, through subtle signals that say, you are no longer aligned, and alignment is everything. To be aligned is to belong. To belong is to exist socially. Over time, people learn that silence is rewarded, more than truth, more than curiosity, more than honesty. Silence preserves relationships. Silence maintains status. Silence avoids risk. The mind learns quickly. It associates questioning with loss and conformity with peace. This conditioning is so deep that people often feel anxious, even thinking forbidden thoughts. The fear appears before the thought is complete. This is not coincidence, it is training inherited across generations, a memory of exclusion encoded into behavior. The system relies on this because it does not have to speak. Normality polices itself. The group enforces boundaries, the individual complies, and power remains untouched. The most effective control is not when people are forced to stay silent. It is when silence feels like the reasonable choice. And the most dangerous person in such a system is not the loud rebel, but the calm individual who asks a question without fear because they signal something the group cannot tolerate. The possibility that belonging may not be worth the price of silence. So who are you really? Not the name you answer to, not the role you perform, not the beliefs you inherited or the opinions you repeat. Strip those away, and what remains? When you remove fear, what is left? When you remove approval, what is left? When you remove the need to belong, what is left? This is not a question society encourages because society survives on answers that arrive quickly, labels that settle uncertainty, identities that keep people in place. But this question does not accept quick answers. It creates space, and space is uncomfortable because it offers no direction. In that space, there is no script, no audience, no reward. There is only awareness observing itself without instruction. Most people rush to fill this silence. They reach for a new identity, a stronger belief, a clearer label, anything to avoid standing alone with no definition, because definition feels like existence. Without it, people feel as if they are fading, but perhaps that feeling is not loss. Perhaps it is the first moment of honesty, before you were told who to be, before you learned how to act, before you measured yourself against others. You existed without explanation. You did not need to justify your presence. You did not need to perform meaning, you simply were. And everything added later. Fear, guilt, pride, ambition, morality was layered on top of that presence. Some of it helped you survive, some of it helped others control you. The danger is not in having an identity. The danger is in forgetting that you are not it. When identity becomes fixed, it limits perception. When perception narrows, choice disappears. And when choice disappears, freedom becomes a story. You tell yourself rather than an experience you live. Asking who you are without the structure does not make you empty. It makes you unbound. But unbound does not feel safe, because safety was always tied to structure. This is why this question feels threatening. It removes excuses, it removes roles, it removes the comfort of being told what you are worth. In its place, it offers responsibility. Not responsibility to obey, but responsibility to see. To notice when you are acting from fear rather than truth. To recognize when you are defending something because it defines you, not because it is right. This question does not demand an answer. It demands awareness. And awareness changes things quietly. You may continue living in the same world, following the same rules, playing the same roles, but something shifts. You are no longer fully contained. You are no longer fully owned. You see the difference between what you are and what you were shaped to be. And once that difference is seen, it cannot be unseen. That is why this question matters. That is why it has always been dangerous. Because systems can survive rebellion, but they struggle to survive awareness. So who are you if no one is watching? If nothing is expected, if nothing needs to be proven? This is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning, the moment when existence stops asking for permission and simply observes itself alive. If fear did not exist, if there were no punishment, no rejection, no loss waiting behind your choices, who would you be? If roles dissolved, if there were no titles to perform, no expectations to fulfill, no image to maintain, who would remain? If obedience were unnecessary, if no rule demanded compliance, no system required loyalty, no authority waited for submission, who would you become? This question is difficult because fear, role, and obedience are not external forces anymore. They live inside the self. They shape instinct before thought. Fear decides what feels dangerous. Role decides what feels appropriate. Obedience decides what feels acceptable. Remove them and the mind loses its map. There is no immediate direction, no clear instruction. And in that moment, many people feel panic, not relief, because panic reveals how deeply guidance was depended upon. Without fear, there is no urgency. Without role, there is no identity. Without obedience, there is no approval. And approval has replaced truth as the measure of worth. So when these structures disappear, the self feels exposed, not liberated, exposed, because nothing remains to hide behind. This is the moment when most people rush to rebuild the cage. They seek a new belief, a new group, a new cause, something to obey, something to become, something to fear. But if you resist that impulse, if you remain in the uncertainty, something else appears, not a new identity, but awareness, a quiet presence that does not demand justification. It does not ask to be useful. It does not ask to be correct. It simply observes. This presence existed before fear was learned, before roles were assigned, before obedience was rewarded. It is not loud. It does not promise meaning or safety, but it is real and it is stable because it does not depend on permission. This is why systems never point people here. A person who discovers themselves without fear, without role, without obedience is difficult to move, difficult to threaten, difficult to define. They no longer ask, "What should I be?" They ask, "What is true?" And truth does not always serve order. This does not mean abandoning society or rejecting responsibility. It means no longer confusing survival with identity. It means acting without surrendering awareness. It means choosing without mistaking choice for approval. So if fear were absent, if roles dissolved, if obedience lost its moral weight, you would not suddenly become someone else. You would stop performing. And what remains is not emptiness. It is the part of you that was never trained, the part that does not need to be managed, the part that does not belong to any system. And that is why this question matters. Because it does not ask you to change the world. It asks you to see yourself before the world told you who to be. Perhaps freedom is not the ability to find answers. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Freedom may not live in certainty or clarity or resolution. Answers settle the mind. They close the door. They allow the world to continue unchanged. But a real question does something different. It opens space, it interrupts habit, it loosens the grip of what feels obvious. When a question is genuine, it does not rush toward conclusion. It stays, it lingers, it refuses to be useful. Freedom may begin there in the moment you stop searching for permission to understand, in the moment you allow uncertainty without immediately filling it with belief. Identity or obedience. The first true question does not promise comfort, it removes it. And in that removal, something honest appears. Not a solution, but awareness. Not direction, but presence. Systems fear this because questions cannot be owned. They cannot be repeated mechanically. They cannot be passed down as rules. A question belongs only to the person who dares to ask it. And once it is asked, nothing returns to its previous shape. You may continue living inside the same structures, speaking the same language, performing the same roles. But something remains awake. You are no longer entirely contained by the answers you were given. You recognize that most of what you were taught to seek was designed to prevent the question from forming. Freedom may not be about escaping the world. It may be about seeing it without the filters that once felt necessary. And perhaps that is why freedom has always felt rare, because it does not arrive as a reward. It arrives as a risk. The risk of standing without answers, without certainty, without permission, and choosing to remain there long enough to see what is real. What are you running from? Most people never ask this question because running feels safer when it remains unnamed. To admit escape feels like weakness, but escape is often not cowardice. It is a form of protection. The mind learns to move away from what threatens its balance, even when that threat is truth. You may be running from pain, not physical pain, but the kind that reveals who you are beneath the surface. Pain exposes the places you have hidden from yourself. It removes excuses, it strips away comforting stories, and humans fear exposure more than suffering because suffering can be explained. Exposure cannot. You may be running from silence, because in silence there is nothing to distract you. No noise, no screen, no task, no voice to fill the space. Silence leaves you alone with yourself. And when you are alone, questions begin to rise. Why am I living this way? Why do I repeat the same days? Why do I feel disconnected from my own life? These questions have no easy answers, and when answers are absent, responsibility appears. Responsibility is heavy because it cannot be delegated. You may be running from your own truth, because truth is not gentle. Truth does not soothe. It wakes. And waking up is painful because it reveals how long you have been asleep, how long you have accepted things that did not belong to you, how long you have called survival a choice. You may be running from choosing. Choice is often romanticized as freedom, but choice is weight. Choosing one path means burying others. It means accepting loss. It means standing by consequences. Many people prefer to say, "This is just how things are done," or "everyone lives this way," because those phrases remove the burden of decision. They turn avoidance into normality. You may be running from loss. Change always demands payment. You lose familiarity, approval, relationships, sometimes even the version of yourself that felt safe. Chains are rarely loved for their restriction. They are loved for their familiarity. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar freedom. You may be running from being alone, not physically alone, but socially unanchored. The fear of being pushed out of the group is ancient. In early human history, exclusion meant death. Today, it feels like invisibility, irrelevance, erasure, and people will silence their thoughts, numb their feelings, and betray their questions to avoid that emptiness. You may be running from losing the image of being good, because truth does not always look kind. Sometimes honesty disrupts comfort. Sometimes silence supports harm. And obedience is often dressed as morality. People obey not because they agree, but because obedience allows them to feel innocent. They can say, "I did nothing wrong, followed the rules." You may even be running from freedom itself, because freedom is not poetic. Freedom isolates. Freedom demands strength. Freedom requires you to carry yourself without support, structures without ready answers, without borrowed meaning. And many people are not prepared for that weight. So they seek ready systems, ready beliefs, ready enemies, ready heroes, because ready-made answers remove the burden of thinking. But the moment you stop thinking, someone else begins thinking for you. So what are you running from? Perhaps you are running from the responsibility of being yourself. Because being yourself is not a statement, it is a daily confrontation. A confrontation with fear, habit, comfort, and the version of normality you were taught to accept. And the hardest part of that confrontation is realizing that the enemy is not always outside. Often it lives inside you, wearing your voice, using your language, protecting your cage. The moment you ask what you are running from, the running begins to slow, because naming the escape turns it into awareness. And awareness is the first step that does not move away, but stands still and looks directly at what was avoided. How does a person run from themselves? Not by leaving, not by disappearing, but by staying busy, by filling every empty space with noise, movement, obligation, and distraction. A person runs from themselves by never allowing silence long enough for an inner voice to form. When the mind is constantly occupied, there is no room for confrontation, only reaction. People confuse motion with progress and stimulation with meaning because stopping would require looking inward. And looking inward is dangerous because it reveals contradictions. A person runs from themselves by adopting ready-made identities, beliefs, opinions, labels, causes. They wear them not because they are true, but because they are available. Identity becomes armor. It gives shape to uncertainty. It provides a script to follow so the individual does not have to ask who they are without it. This is why people defend identities so aggressively. Losing them would mean facing the unknown within. A person runs from themselves by repeating routines, even when those routines feel empty. Familiar suffering feels safer than unfamiliar change, because change requires admitting that the current life is not honest, and honesty threatens the image a person has built. A person runs from themselves by externalizing blame. They point outward at systems, people, circumstances, anything that explains dissatisfaction without requiring self-examination. This does not mean the systems are innocent, but focusing only on them allows the individual to avoid the more uncomfortable question: what part of me participates in this? A person runs from themselves by moralizing instead of understanding. They divide the world into good and bad, right and wrong, because complexity demands reflection. Moral certainty provides relief. It closes inquiry. It allows the person to feel correct without being conscious. A person runs from themselves by numbing. Feeling less is easier than feeling deeply. Numbness is not absence of pain, it is avoidance of meaning. A person also runs from themselves by postponing life. They say later, when things settle, when I am ready, when the time is right. These phrases delay responsibility indefinitely. They create the illusion of patience while protecting fear. And perhaps the most subtle form of escape is self-narration, constantly telling a story about who you are, why you are this way, what happened to you. Stories organize experience, but they can also trap it. When the story becomes fixed, growth feels like betrayal. A person runs from themselves, not because they are weak, but because meeting oneself without distraction, without justification, without role, is one of the most demanding experiences possible. There is no applause, there is no approval, there is no guidance, only awareness, and awareness offers no comfort. It offers clarity. This is why people rarely stop running, and why those who do are often misunderstood, because a person who no longer runs is not dramatic. They are quiet. They no longer need to escape themselves, and that makes them difficult to control and impossible to deceive fully. Are your thoughts really yours, or do they simply feel that way because they arrive in your voice? Most people never question this because thinking feels intimate. It feels personal. A thought appears inside the mind and ownership is assumed. But thoughts do not emerge in a vacuum. They are shaped long before you notice them. by language you did not invent, by fears you inherited, by values you absorbed before you could question them. The mind is not an empty space, generating ideas freely. It is a conditioned environment responding to patterns. When you think, you are often recalling, rearranging, and repeating rather than discovering. This does not make you passive, it makes you human. From childhood, you are taught not only what to think, but how to think. What is reasonable, what is dangerous, what is acceptable, what is ridiculous. Over time, these boundaries become invisible. You stop noticing them because you stop pushing against them. A thought that never reaches consciousness cannot be questioned, and so control does not require censorship. It requires familiarity. The most powerful thoughts are not imposed, they are normalized. You recognize them because everyone around you shares them. Agreement feels like truth because isolation feels threatening. This is why certain ideas feel obvious while others feel unthinkable. Not because they are wrong, but because they fall outside the mental climate you were raised in. Even rebellion often follows predictable patterns. It reacts within the same framework it claims to oppose. True independence of thought is rare, not because people lack intelligence, but because independence requires discomfort. It requires sitting with uncertainty without rushing to align. It requires noticing when a thought feels right, simply because it feels familiar. The mind prefers coherence over truth, consistency over accuracy, belonging over exploration. This is not a flaw. It is a survival adaptation, but when adaptation becomes identity, thinking becomes repetition, and repetition feels like choice. The moment you pause and observe a thought, instead of agreeing with it, something shifts. You begin to see its origin, its tone, its purpose. You ask, where did this come from? Who benefits from me believing this? What fear does it soothe? What role does it protect? This does not mean rejecting every thought. It means reclaiming awareness. Thinking freely does not mean thinking differently all the time. It means knowing when a thought is yours because you examined it, not because you inherited it. The danger is not that your thoughts are influenced. The danger is forgetting that they are. And when that forgetting becomes permanent, the mind becomes a corridor rather than a space. A place where ideas pass through unchanged, defended without reflection. And perhaps the first truly personal thought is not an opinion at all, but a question. The quiet moment when you realize that what you think may not define you, and that awareness itself is something no system can fully own. What is holding you back? If fear were the only barrier, change would be simple. Remove the threat and movement would follow. But even when fear fades, most people remain exactly where they are. This reveals something more subtle than fear, something quieter and more persistent: comfort. Comfort does not feel like a prison. It feels like relief. It feels like stability. It feels like having survived something difficult and finally being allowed to rest. But comfort has a hidden structure. It slowly replaces curiosity with routine. It replaces questioning with familiarity. Over time, the mind begins to associate safety, not with truth, but with repetition. Anything unfamiliar starts to feel unnecessary, risky, excessive, even when it is honest. Comfort narrows the world gently. It does not push. It invites you to stay. Just a little longer, just like this. And soon staying becomes identity. This is how comfort turns into a chain, without ever tightening around the wrists. The phrase, "it is fine," like this, seems harmless. It sounds mature, reasonable, balanced. But it carries a quiet danger. It shuts down possibility. It ends inquiry. It transforms dissatisfaction into tolerance, and tolerance into acceptance. People rarely remain in situations because they believe they are good. They remain because they believe they are manageable. Manageable pain feels preferable to uncertain freedom, because freedom requires reorientation. It requires learning new ways of seeing, thinking, being. and the mind resists that effort. It prefers the known, even when the known is limiting. This is why people stay in roles, beliefs, relationships, and lives that no longer fit. They are not trapped by force, they are held by habit. Habit is powerful because it removes the need to decide. When decisions disappear, responsibility disappears, and responsibility is heavy. The invisible prison is built from small choices made repeatedly. Not to speak, not to leave, not to risk, not now, maybe later. These choices feel neutral, but together they form a structure, a life that moves but does not change, a routine that functions but does not evolve. Over time, the individual forgets that change was ever possible. The bars are not seen because they are made of familiarity. The door is not opened because it has never been tested. This is the genius of invisible control. It does not require obedience, it requires comfort. It does not demand loyalty, it offers convenience. And convenience is rarely questioned, because questioning disrupts ease. The system does not need to stop you from leaving. It only needs to make staying feel reasonable. And the most effective prison is not the one you are forced into. It is the one you learn to justify. The moment you ask, "What is holding me back?" you begin to see that the answer is rarely external. It is the quiet agreement you made with comfort, the belief that survival is enough, that functioning is sufficient, that longing can be postponed indefinitely. But comfort does not ask how alive you are. It only asks whether you are still manageable, and as long as that question remains unanswered, the invisible prison remains intact, unchallenged, unnamed, and perfectly stable. What actually changes a person is rarely comfort. People do not transform because life is gentle. They transform because something interrupts the story they were living. Trauma is one of those interruptions. Trauma breaks continuity. It shatters the assumption that the world is predictable, fair, or stable. After trauma, the mind can no longer rely on old explanations. The body remembers what language cannot explain. And once that memory settles, the person is no longer who they were before. Even if they try to return, even if they pretend nothing changed, trauma forces awareness. It removes illusion violently. It does not ask permission. But trauma alone does not always transform. Sometimes it only hardens. Loss works differently. Loss empties, loss creates absence, not noise. It leaves a space where something once was. A person you loved, a future you expected, a version of yourself you relied on. In that emptiness, the mind searches for meaning, and when meaning cannot be restored, the person must either rebuild blindly or begin to question deeply. Loss teaches impermanence not as a concept, but as a lived truth, and that truth quietly reshapes priorities, values, and identity. But there is an even subtler force that changes people. A question, a real question. Not one asked casually, but one that refuses to leave. A question that cannot be answered with habit, belief, or borrowed language. This kind of question destabilizes from the inside. It creates tension between who you are and what you are living, and that tension demands resolution. Either the question is silenced or the self is re-examined. Those who change are often those who allow the question to remain open long enough to do its work. And then there is solitude, not loneliness imposed by rejection, but chosen or unavoidable aloneness. Solitude removes mirrors. When no one is there to reflect you back to yourself, the performance collapses. You are no longer reinforced by approval, correction, or expectation. In solitude, the self loses its audience, and without an audience, many identities dissolve. What remains is uncomfortable, uncertain, and raw, but it is also honest. Solitude does not change people by adding something. It changes them by removing reinforcement. It reveals who you are when nothing is required of you. Trauma breaks the structure, loss empties it, questions destabilize it, solitude exposes it. None of these are gentle, none of them promise comfort, but they share one quality. They interrupt automatic living. They force the individual out of repetition and into awareness. People do not change when they are told to. They change when the old self can no longer hold together, when the story collapses under its own weight. And in that collapse, something quieter emerges. Not a new role, not a stronger identity, but a deeper attentiveness to reality. Change is not an upgrade, it is a shedding. And what remains after shedding is not better or worse. It is simply less constructed, and that is why real change is rare, because it demands letting go not only of pain, but of familiarity. And familiarity is often the last thing people are willing to lose. Are your thoughts really yours, or do they only feel personal because they speak in your voice? A thought appears and you assume ownership because it happens inside your mind. But the place where a thought appears does not determine where it comes from. Long before you could question anything, your mind was shaped by language. You did not choose values, you absorbed without consent. Fears passed down quietly through tone, reaction, and silence. You were not taught only information, you were taught boundaries of what can be said, what can be imagined, what feels safe to believe. Most thoughts are not born, they are triggered. They arise as responses to conditioning, to memory, to repetition. When you think, you are often remembering rather than discovering. The mind prefers familiar paths because familiarity feels like truth. Agreement feels like correctness because disagreement risks isolation. This is why certain ideas feel obvious while others feel uncomfortable even before they are examined. Discomfort is not always a sign of error. It is often a sign of unfamiliarity, but the mind avoids unfamiliarity because it threatens coherence, and coherence is mistaken for identity. From childhood, you learn which thoughts earn approval and which bring correction. Over time, this training becomes invisible. You no longer hear the external voice guiding you because it has become internalized. You stop asking, "Is this true?" and begin asking, "Does this fit?" Even rebellion often follows predictable patterns. It reacts within the same structure it claims to resist because stepping completely outside requires standing alone with uncertainty. True independent thought is rare, not because people lack intelligence, but because independence demands emotional cost. It requires sitting with doubt without immediately resolving it. It requires noticing when a thought feels right simply because it is repeated everywhere. When you pause and observe a thought instead of agreeing with it, something changes. You begin to sense its origin, its purpose, its emotional reward. You ask, what does this belief protect? Who does it serve? What fear does it calm? What identity does it reinforce? This does not mean rejecting influence. Influence is unavoidable. The difference is awareness. A thought examined becomes a choice. A thought unexamined becomes a command. The danger is not that your thoughts are shaped. The danger is forgetting that they are. When forgetting becomes permanent, the mind turns into a passageway. Ideas pass through unchanged. Defended, automatically repeated with conviction, and the self mistakes repetition for authenticity. Perhaps the first truly personal act of thinking is not forming an opinion at all, but creating space. A pause between thought and belief. A moment where you realize you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness that notices them, and awareness cannot be inherited. It must be claimed quietly without permission. And once that happens, the question is no longer, are your thoughts yours? The question becomes, which thoughts are you willing to let go of once you see where they came from? What is holding you in place? If fear were the true barrier, then the moment fear disappeared, change would be automatic. But this rarely happens. People remain where they are even when nothing is actively threatening them. This reveals that fear is not the strongest force. Comfort is. Comfort does not feel restrictive. It feels reasonable, it feels earned, it feels like stability after chaos. But comfort slowly replaces movement with maintenance. It teaches the mind that survival is sufficient and that anything beyond it is unnecessary risk. Over time, comfort reshapes desire. You stop asking what is true and begin asking what is manageable. The familiar becomes sacred not because it is right, but because it is known. This is how comfort turns into a chain without ever tightening. The phrase, "this is fine," like "this seems harmless, even wise," it suggests acceptance, maturity, realism, but hidden inside it is surrender. It closes the door to possibility. It quiets dissatisfaction before it becomes clarity. It turns longing into something childish and change into something irresponsible. People rarely stay in lives they believe are good. They stay in lives they believe they can tolerate. Toleration is powerful because it does not demand action. It allows stagnation to disguise itself as peace. The mind prefers a predictable discomfort over an uncertain transformation, because transformation requires effort loss and the collapse of identity. You must admit that what you are living is not aligned, and that admission threatens the story you tell yourself about who you are. The invisible prison is built from repetition, from habits that remove decision, from routines that no longer ask why, from days that look functional but feel empty. Over time, the person forgets that movement was ever possible. The walls are not visible because they are made of normality. No one is forcing you to stay. You stay because leaving would require redefining yourself, and redefining yourself is harder than enduring what no longer fits. This is the quiet danger of saying, "It is good enough." Good enough does not hurt, but it slowly erases vitality. It does not break you, it preserves you in a reduced form. Systems depend on this mindset because it produces stability without resistance. A person who accepts good enough will not question structure, will not disturb balance, will not demand more than is offered. They will function, they will comply, and they will call it choice. The moment you ask, "What is holding me?" you begin to see that it is rarely fear. It is the agreement you made with comfort, the belief that functioning is living, that endurance is meaning, that postponement is wisdom. But comfort does not ask whether you are alive. It only asks whether you are still predictable. And as long as predictability feels safer than truth, the invisible chain remains unbroken. Quiet, efficient, and unquestioned. What is holding you in place? If fear were the true barrier, then the moment fear disappeared, change would be automatic. But this rarely happens. People remain where they are, even when nothing is actively threatening them. This reveals that fear is not the strongest force. Comfort is. Comfort does not feel restrictive. It feels reasonable, it feels earned, it feels like stability after chaos. But comfort slowly replaces movement with maintenance. It teaches the mind that survival is sufficient and that anything beyond it is unnecessary risk. Over time, comfort reshapes desire. You stop asking what is true and begin asking what is manageable. The familiar becomes sacred not because it is right, but because it is known. This is how comfort turns into a chain without ever tightening. The phrase, "this is fine," like "this seems harmless, even wise," it suggests acceptance, maturity, realism, but hidden inside it is surrender. It closes the door to possibility. It quiets dissatisfaction before it becomes clarity. It turns longing into something childish and change into something irresponsible. People rarely stay in lives they believe are good. They stay in lives they believe they can tolerate. Toleration is powerful because it does not demand action. It allows stagnation to disguise itself as peace. The mind prefers a predictable discomfort over an uncertain transformation, because transformation requires effort loss and the collapse of identity. You must admit that what you are living is not aligned, And that admission threatens the story you tell yourself about who you are. The invisible prison is built from repetition, from habits that remove decision, from routines that no longer ask why, from days that look functional but feel empty. Over time, the person forgets that movement was ever possible. The walls are not visible because they are made of normality. No one is forcing you to stay. You stay because leaving would require redefining yourself, and redefining yourself is harder than enduring what no longer fits. This is the quiet danger of saying, "It is good enough." Good enough does not hurt, but it slowly erases vitality. It does not break you, it preserves you in a reduced form. Systems depend on this mindset because it produces stability without resistance. A person who accepts good enough will not question structure, will not disturb balance, will not demand more than is offered. They will function, they will comply, and they will call it choice. The moment you ask, "What is holding me?" you begin to see that it is rarely fear. It is the agreement you made with comfort, the belief that functioning is living, that endurance is meaning, that postponement is wisdom. But comfort does not ask whether you are alive. It only asks whether you are still predictable. And as long as predictability feels safer than truth, the invisible chain remains unbroken. Quiet, efficient, and unquestioned. Why do systems always seem to win, even when they are unjust, even when they are cruel, even when everyone quietly knows they are wrong? The answer is not simply power or violence. Systems rarely survive on force alone. Force is expensive, visible, and unstable. What allows systems to endure is something far more subtle. They align themselves with human weakness and human need. A system does not need to defeat every individual. It only needs to outlast them. Humans are temporary. Systems are designed to be continuous. Individuals grow tired, they age, they lose hope, they adapt. Systems do not feel fatigue, they do not doubt. They do not suffer loss the way humans do. A system waits. It absorbs resistance, it survives generations by replacing people faster than people can change it. This is why systems appear invincible. They are not stronger than humans. They are longer lived. Systems also win because they rarely present themselves as enemies. They present themselves as necessities. Order, stability, security, normality. They frame themselves as the solution to chaos. And chaos is something humans fear deeply, because chaos removes predictability, and predictability feels like safety. Even when it is harmful, people cling to systems not because they love them, but because the alternative feels like free fall. Systems understand this. They do not need to be good. They only need to appear inevitable. Another reason systems win is because they divide responsibility. A system never says, "I chose this." It says, "This is how things work." This removes personal accountability. No one feels fully responsible, and so no one feels fully empowered to change it. Harm becomes procedural. Violence becomes policy. Suffering becomes collateral. And because no single individual can be blamed, resistance loses focus. It becomes exhausted, searching for an enemy that has no face. Systems also succeed because they teach people to identify with them. When people see themselves as part of the system, they defend it as if they are defending themselves. Criticism feels personal, reform feels threatening, collapse feels like self-destruction. This is why people often protect systems that harm them. Leaving the system would mean losing identity, belonging, and meaning. Systems provide ready answers, ready roles, ready values, ready explanations. For many people, this is enough. They trade freedom for structure without realizing the cost, because the cost is paid slowly, quietly across a lifetime. Systems also master time. They do not rush. Humans demand immediate results. Systems think in decades. If resistance does not succeed quickly, people give up. The system remains unchanged, waiting for the next generation to forget the previous one. History is filled with movements that burned brightly and then faded, while the structure they opposed adapted and continued. Systems win not because they are perfect, but because they are patient, and because they rely on the fact that most humans want relief more than truth, comfort more than confrontation, stability more than freedom. In the end, systems do not truly defeat humans. Humans maintain them. People follow rules they did not choose, defend norms they did not create, obey structures they no longer question, and they call this reality. The system does not need to win every battle. It only needs people to stop believing that change is possible. And once that belief fades, the system no longer needs force. It survives on resignation. And resignation is the quietest victory of all. If you speak where everyone else is silent, something shifts immediately. Not always loudly, not always visibly, but the atmosphere changes. Silence is not empty, it is agreement. And when you break it, you interrupt a contract that was never spoken yet deeply understood. The group did not gather to hear the truth. It gathered to maintain balance. Silence keeps that balance intact. Speaking does not just add sound, it introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is destabilizing. The first reaction you face is rarely open hostility. It is confusion, a pause, a subtle tightening. People look away, they change the subject, they smile politely. Silence tries to reassert itself. If that fails, you are redefined. You are called emotional, extreme, inappropriate, dramatic. Not because you are wrong, but because you are disruptive. You remind others of what they chose not to see. And this is uncomfortable, because your voice creates contrast. And contrast reveals choice. If you speak, then silence becomes a decision, not a necessity. And decisions carry responsibility. This is why the group reacts. The cost of speaking is rarely immediate punishment. It is distance. It is the slow withdrawal of warmth. You are no longer echoed. You are no longer mirrored. Conversations become cautious. Your presence becomes inconvenient. You feel this before you understand it. Speaking isolates not because people hate you, but because they fear what you represent. A reminder that silence is optional. A reminder that comfort has a price. A reminder that obedience is not the only way to belong. History shows this pattern again and again. Those who spoke when others were silent were not always persecuted violently. They were ignored, marginalized, dismissed, ridiculed. Over time, their words were separated from them, quoted without credit, remembered without context, or erased entirely. Silence then returns, and life continues, but something remains. Once silence is broken, it can never fully close again. Even if the speaker is removed, the possibility lingers. Others remember that moment. They remember that someone dared, and that memory creates tension. The system does not fear noise. It fears precedent. Speaking once makes speaking again imaginable. This is why the first voice is always treated as dangerous, not because it changes everything immediately, but because it changes what can be imagined, and imagination is where systems begin to weaken. If you speak where everyone else is silent, you may lose approval, belonging, certainty. You may feel exposed, unsupported, alone, but you gain something quieter. You gain alignment between what you see and what you say, between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. That alignment is rare and it is costly, but it is also the foundation of integrity. The choice to speak is not heroic. It is not comfortable. It does not guarantee change. Often it changes nothing externally, but it changes you. You cross a line you cannot uncross. Silence no longer feels neutral. Obedience no longer feels innocent. You become aware, and awareness is irreversible. This is why most people remain silent, not because they do not know, but because they know the cost. And this is the final truth. Silence is not the absence of courage. It is the calculation of loss. And speaking is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that some losses are no longer acceptable. History does not remember silence. It is built around the few moments when silence was broken. Every era had a shared agreement, an unspoken understanding of what must not be questioned, what must not be said, what must remain accepted. Those agreements kept societies stable. They kept order intact, but they also required silence. And in every age, there were people who disrupted that silence, not with weapons, not with armies, but with words. They did not always intend to rebel. Often they simply asked a question that no one was supposed to ask. They spoke when everyone else understood that survival depended on remaining quiet. History shows a pattern. When silence dominates, speaking becomes an act of danger, not because the words are violent, but because they expose the agreement beneath the silence. In ancient cities, people gathered in public spaces, repeating the same beliefs until one voice questioned the foundation and was removed, not for being wrong, but for unsettling certainty. In religious ages, faith was shared collectively, and doubt was treated not as curiosity, but as corruption. Those who spoke differently were not debated. They were erased, branded heretical, exiled or burned because allowing the question to exist threatened the structure that gave life meaning. In empires, loyalty was praised, and obedience was framed as virtue. Those who spoke of justice rather than order were treated as unstable, dangerous, divisive. Their voices disrupted the illusion that the system was natural and inevitable. In modern times, silence takes a different form. It is no longer enforced only by punishment, but by social cost. Those who speak against dominant narratives are labeled extreme, emotional, irresponsible, or harmful, not because their arguments fail, but because their presence creates discomfort. History does not punish cruelty as quickly as it punishes disruption. Cruel systems often survive for centuries, but individuals who speak when silence is expected are dealt with swiftly because they introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads. Once one person speaks, others realize they could have spoken too. Silence is exposed as choice, not fate. This is why the first voice is always the most dangerous. It does not need to be correct, it only needs to exist. History later celebrates these voices, long after the risk has passed, long after the system has changed. Statues are built, books are written, names are honored, but during their lifetime, these individuals were isolated, misunderstood, and often destroyed. They were not heroes in their own time, they were inconveniences. Their presence reminded others of what they had accepted without questioning. This is the hidden cost of speaking, the loss of belonging, the loss of safety, the loss of being considered normal. History moves forward not because the majority changes, but because a minority breaks the silence and pays the price. Silence is comfortable, it protects routine, it maintains identity. Speaking interrupts that comfort, it forces choice, and choice brings responsibility. This is why most people remain silent, not because they are ignorant, but because they understand exactly what speaking costs. And this is the final lesson. History leaves us. Those who spoke where everyone else was silent were not extraordinary beings. They were ordinary humans who decided that the cost of silence had become greater than the cost of speaking. And every system that ever fell began at that precise moment when silence was no longer unanimous, and someone dared to say what everyone already knew, but was afraid to voice. History does not end with solutions, it ends with patterns. When you look closely across centuries, across civilizations, across belief systems, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The structures change, the names change, the symbols change, but the mechanism remains. Humans seek meaning, systems provide it. Humans fear chaos, systems promise order. Humans want belonging, systems define identity. This exchange has repeated itself. Since the first communities formed, history is not a story of progress from darkness to light. It is a cycle of control becoming invisible. Force turns into belief. Belief turns into morality. Morality turns into identity, and identity turns into self-regulation. By the time a system is questioned, it has already shaped the questioner. History shows that oppression rarely survives through cruelty alone. It survives through participation, through silence, through people who believe they are choosing, when they are maintaining what history records as obedience, often felt like normal life to those living it. What history condemns as injustice often felt like stability to those benefiting from it. This is why history is written after systems fall, never while they rule. Distance reveals what proximity hides. The past looks obvious only because it is no longer threatening, but the present always feels reasonable. While you are inside it, history does not ask you to judge those who came before. It asks you to recognize the same forces operating now. Fear of exclusion, comfort of routine. Desire for certainty, need for identity. These are not flaws. They are human, but systems learn to build themselves around these needs. And when they do, resistance becomes rare, not because people are blind, but because they are adapted. Every system that ever collapsed did so. Not when everyone rebelled, but when enough people stopped believing that the system defined reality. History does not move when answers are found. It moves when questions can no longer be silenced. This is the final lesson history leaves behind. Not that freedom is guaranteed, not that truth always wins, but that awareness changes the conditions of control. The moment a person sees the pattern, they are no longer fully inside it. They may still live within the system, but they no longer confuse it with truth. History cannot tell you what to do. It can only show you what has happened again and again. And that repetition asks something of you. Not obedience, not rebellion, but consciousness. Because systems endure through unconscious participation, and they weaken when awareness spreads quietly without permission. History does not end, it waits. And what happens next has always depended not on the system itself, but on how many people begin to see it for what it is. And now the question is no longer historical, it is personal. After everything you have seen, after every pattern revealed, after every silence examined, the story does not end with the past. It ends here with you. History does not repeat itself because people forget dates or names. It repeats because the same fears remain, the same desires, the same need to belong, the same reluctance to stand alone. Systems change their language, but they rely on the same human instincts, and those instincts live in you as much as they lived in anyone before you. This is not an accusation, it is a recognition. You are not separate from history, you are its continuation. Most people who lived inside harmful systems did not believe they were doing harm. They believed they were being normal. They followed rules, they fulfilled roles. They stayed quiet when speaking felt dangerous. They chose comfort when truth demanded sacrifice. And they told themselves the same things people tell themselves. Now, this is just how the world works. There is nothing I can do. It has always been this way. History judges them harshly, but history also reminds us that they were human. And that is the uncomfortable part, because it means the same conditions still apply today. The same mechanisms are still operating. Silence is still rewarded. Questioning is still costly. Conformity is still mistaken for morality. And freedom is still defined in ways that do not threaten structure. This is why awareness matters, not because it turns you into a hero, but because it prevents you from becoming unconscious. History does not require you to overthrow systems. It requires you to see them, to recognize when obedience feels natural, to notice when silence feels reasonable, to question when comfort asks you to stay smaller than you are. Awareness does not make life easier. It makes it honest, and honesty carries weight. Once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. You may still participate, you may still compromise. You may still choose safety at times, but you will know what you are doing. And that knowledge changes the meaning of every choice. Systems survive on unconscious participation. They weaken when people act with awareness, even quietly, even privately, even imperfectly. The most important changes in history did not begin with mass rebellion. They began with individuals who stopped confusing normal with inevitable, who stopped mistaking order for truth, who stopped believing that silence was neutral. You do not need to be fearless. You do not need to be loud. You do not need to be certain. You only need to remain aware. Awareness interrupts repetition. It creates friction where there was automatic motion. It introduces space where control once flowed effortlessly. This is where freedom actually begins, not as an answer, not as a destination, but as a state of seeing. And perhaps this is the final truth history offers. Not that systems will fall, not that justice always prevails, but that every system depends on how deeply people forget themselves, and every moment of awareness weakens that dependence. So the question you are left with is not what should change in the world. The question is quieter and far more difficult. What will you do now that you see the pattern? Will you rush to forget it? Will you explain it away? Will you tell yourself this is only history? Or will you allow it to stay with you quietly, influencing how you speak, how you remain silent, how you obey, and how you choose? Because history does not end with answers. It waits. And what comes next has always depended on how many people choose awareness over comfort. Even when no one is watching, even when nothing immediately changes, even when the cost feels high, this is where history pauses and where responsibility begins. History does not repeat itself in events. It repeats itself in patterns. The dates change. The names change. The borders shift. But the human mind beneath them remains strikingly familiar. Every empire believes it is unique. Every civilization believes it has learned from the past. And yet when power rises, it rises in the same way, driven by the same fears, sustained by the same promises, and protected by the same justifications. This is not because leaders study old empires. It is because they govern the same psychology. Humans have always struggled with uncertainty. Chaos terrifies the mind more deeply than injustice does. Disorder feels like threat. Even when order is cruel, it feels safer than the unknown. And whenever societies grow large enough that individuals can no longer know one another, personally, systems emerge to replace trust. These systems are built not on truth, but on predictability. Empires begin as solutions to fear. They promise stability, they promise safety, they promise continuity. In exchange, they ask for obedience. At first, this exchange feels reasonable, even necessary. People do not experience it as oppression. They experience it as relief, because something frightening has been named, controlled and organized. History shows that empires are rarely born from ambition alone. They are born from anxiety, the anxiety that without authority, society will collapse. The anxiety that without hierarchy, nothing will hold. The anxiety that without force, order will dissolve. This fear is not irrational. It is human, but it becomes dangerous when it hardens into belief. When belief turns into structure, and structure turns into identity. Once identity is formed, the empire no longer needs constant violence. People begin to defend the system because it explains who they are. Citizen, subject, chosen, civilized, loyal. These labels carry comfort. They answer the question of belonging, and belonging is one of the deepest human needs. This is why people often protect empires even when they suffer under them. The empire gives them a place in the world. Without it, they would face uncertainty again. History repeats because this exchange is seductive. It offers meaning in a world that feels unstable. It offers direction in a world that feels overwhelming, and it offers belonging in a world where isolation feels like death. Empires understand this intuitively. They do not need everyone to believe, only enough people to comply. And compliance is easier when obedience feels moral, when loyalty feels virtuous, when questioning feels dangerous. This is why the tools of empire evolve, while the psychology remains constant. Ancient empires used gods and myths. Medieval empires used faith and divine order. Modern empires use progress, security, and choice. The language changes, the symbols change, but the psychological contract remains the same. Give up some freedom, receive order. Give up uncertainty, receive identity. Give up questioning, receive belonging. History does not repeat because people forget. It repeats because the same human needs are activated again and again: fear of chaos, desire for meaning, need for acceptance. These forces shape empires more reliably than weapons ever could. And as long as these needs remain unexamined, power will continue to build itself around them. This is why looking at history as a series of events misses the deeper truth. What endures is not empire, but the psychological conditions that allow empire to exist. Until those conditions are understood, the future will continue to resemble the past. Not because humans are doomed, but because psychology unexamined becomes destiny. Every empire begins with fear, not confidence. Before conquest, before ideology, before expansion, there is a perception of threat. The threat may be real or imagined, external or internal, but it must exist because fear is the most reliable trigger for collective obedience. When humans feel threatened, they seek protection. When protection is offered, they accept authority. The first imperial reflex is not domination, it is defense, or at least the story of defense. Early empires did not announce themselves as empires. They presented themselves as responses to danger: invading tribes, hostile neighbors, internal disorder, moral decay, chaos at the borders. Fear creates urgency, and urgency suspends questioning. People do not ask whether power is justified when they believe survival is at stake. They ask only whether it is strong enough. This is how authority is born without resistance. Once fear enters the collective mind, compromise feels irresponsible. Doubt feels disloyal. Hesitation feels dangerous. The empire frames itself as the barrier between order and collapse. And this framing is powerful because it aligns authority with safety. To oppose power then feels like exposing the group to danger. Even when the threat fades, the structure remains. Fear leaves a residue. It reshapes perception. It teaches people to see uncertainty as risk and risk as something to be eliminated. This is why empires often exaggerate threats. They must keep fear alive to justify their existence. An empire without danger begins to look unnecessary. So danger is maintained through language, imagery, ritual, and memory. Past invasions are repeated in stories. Enemies are described as eternal. Values are framed as under constant attack. The population lives in a state of readiness, always one step away from crisis. In such conditions, people accept restrictions they would normally reject. Surveillance feels protective. Control feels caring. Obedience feels rational. Fear also simplifies the world. It divides reality into us and them, safe and dangerous, loyal and suspicious. This reduction is comforting. Complexity requires thought. Fear demands action. Empires rely on this simplification because it turns large, diverse populations into a unified mass with a shared emotional response. Once people fear together, they move together. They obey together, they justify together. This is why the first imperial reflex is always psychological before it is military. The battlefield is the mind. Once fear has defined the threat, power defines the solution, and the solution always involves concentration of authority, emergency measures, exceptional rules, temporary sacrifices that quietly become permanent. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Fear opens the door, authority enters, and once inside, it rearranges the house. Fear teaches people to trade freedom for protection, but protection rarely arrives without conditions. The empire does not say, obey forever. It says, obey for now until the danger passes. But the danger is never allowed to pass, because fear is the foundation on which control rests. When fear becomes normal, the extraordinary becomes acceptable. The empire no longer needs to convince. It only needs to remind people remember what they are afraid of. They remember why obedience once felt necessary, and memory keeps them compliant long after the original threat has disappeared. This is the first step in every imperial story, not conquest, not ambition, but fear. And once fear defines reality, power shapes everything that follows. Once fear has prepared the ground, power seeks permanence, and permanence cannot be built on force alone. Force fades when generations change. What endures is meaning. This is where God's destiny and the sacred enter history, not as spiritual accidents, but as psychological architecture. Early empires understood something fundamental. Fear can mobilize people, but belief can stabilize them. A threat explains why obedience is necessary. A God explains why obedience is right. When power aligns itself with the sacred, it no longer appears human, it appears inevitable. Gods transform authority into order. Destiny transforms conquest into fate, and sacredness transforms violence into duty. This shift is subtle but decisive. When power claims divine backing, resistance stops being political and becomes moral. To oppose the empire is no longer to disagree. It is to offend the cosmic order. This is why empires consistently wrap themselves in sacred language. Kings become chosen, rulers become representatives, warriors become instruments of higher will. Even suffering is reframed as meaningful. Pain is no longer pointless, it is part of a larger plan. This idea is powerful because it answers the most dangerous question people ask during hardship: why is this happening to me? Destiny removes that question. It replaces uncertainty with acceptance. If something is destined, it must be endured. If something is sacred, it must not be questioned. This is not comfort, it is control disguised as meaning. The sacred creates distance between human decisions and human consequences. When atrocities are committed, responsibility dissolves because no one feels fully accountable. They were following destiny. They were serving the divine. They were protecting what is holy. This psychological separation allows empires to expand without collapsing under guilt. The sacred also freezes hierarchy. When power is sanctified, inequality becomes natural. Some are chosen, others are not. Some rule, others obey. This division no longer requires justification because it is framed as part of the universe itself. Challenging hierarchy then feels like challenging reality. Empires rely on this because it stabilizes roles across generations. A child born into obedience is told, "This is how the world works." And because the world itself is sacred, the structure feels permanent. Gods and destiny also solve another imperial problem. Time empires need continuity beyond individual rulers. Sacred narratives provide that they outlive kings, dynasties, and even borders. As long as the belief survives, the structure can be rebuilt. This is why empires fall, yet their psychological framework reappears under new names, new gods, new ideals, new sacred values. The language evolves, but the function remains. The sacred defines limits. It marks certain ideas as untouchable, certain questions as dangerous, certain truths as forbidden. And once limits are internalized, enforcement becomes unnecessary. People protect the sacred themselves. They silence doubt. They punish heresy. They defend the system even when it harms them, because harm feels acceptable if it serves something higher. This is the genius of sanctified power. It does not demand obedience, it inspires it. People do not submit because they are forced. They submit because they believe submission is meaningful. Empires that master the sacred do not rule bodies alone. They rule interpretation. They decide what events mean, what suffering signifies, what obedience represents, and once meaning is controlled, behavior follows naturally. This is why God's destiny and sacredness appear in every imperial story, not because humans are spiritual by nature, but because power understands that belief lasts longer than fear, and when belief replaces force, the empire no longer needs to fight its people. They fight for it, willingly convinced that they are participating in something eternal, rather than serving something human. Once fear has been established and meaning has been sanctified, the next step is subtle but decisive. The creation of the obedient human empires do not survive by controlling behavior alone. They survive by shaping the kind of person who no longer needs to be controlled. Obedience must stop feeling imposed and begin to feel natural. This is not achieved through punishment alone, but through formation. The obedient human is not born. They are produced slowly across childhood, ritual, education, and repetition. From an early age, individuals are taught not only what to do, but who they are. Loyalty becomes a virtue. Patience becomes maturity. Acceptance becomes wisdom. Questioning becomes immaturity or danger. The obedient human learns to associate safety with compliance and belonging with silence. Over time, obedience detaches from fear and attaches to identity. A person does not obey because they are threatened. They obey because obedience feels like who they are. This transformation is crucial, because a human who obeys out of fear will resist when fear weakens. But a human who obeys out of identity will defend obedience even when it causes harm. Empires understand this instinctively. They invest in symbols, ceremonies, uniforms, language, and roles. These are not decoration, they are psychological tools. They teach the individual how to see themselves. A soldier is not merely someone who fights. A citizen is not merely someone who lives within borders. These identities carry emotional weight: pride, shame, honor, duty. Once these emotions are attached to roles, the individual becomes self-regulating. They monitor their thoughts before anyone else does. They feel guilt without being accused. They feel anxiety without being threatened. This is the most efficient form of control, because the empire no longer needs to watch closely. The individual does the watching for it. The obedient human also learns to mistake morality for conformity. Doing what is expected feels good. Disrupting order feels wrong, even when order is unjust. This is how obedience becomes ethical rather than political. The question is no longer, is this right? The question becomes, is this appropriate? This shift removes resistance, because moral people rarely see themselves as instruments of harm. They believe they are protecting stability, decency, or tradition. Empires rely on this belief. The obedient human is also trained to fear isolation more than injustice. To stand apart is framed as selfish, dangerous, or unstable. Belonging becomes conditional on alignment, and alignment becomes survival. The individual learns quickly. They soften their edges, they silence their doubts, they adapt their language, and they call this maturity. What is lost in this process is not intelligence, but independence. The obedient human can think brilliantly within permitted boundaries, but struggles to imagine outside them. This is why obedience does not look like ignorance. It looks like competence functioning responsibility. Empires do not need unthinking subjects, they need reliable ones, people who question privately but comply publicly, people who feel uneasy but remain loyal, people who sense contradiction but prioritize order. This is the finished product of imperial psychology, a population that maintains itself. The invention is complete when obedience no longer feels like submission, but like common sense. At that point, power becomes invisible. And invisible power is the hardest to dismantle, because it no longer appears as power. It appears as normal life. And when obedience becomes normal, the empire does not need to rule aggressively. It simply continues while people live inside. It convinced that nothing else was ever possible. Every empire eventually needs an enemy, not always because an enemy truly exists, but because identity requires contrast. Once obedience has been normalized and roles have been internalized, the next psychological step is division. The world is split into us and them. Belonging is defined not only by who you are, but by who you are not. This distinction simplifies reality, and simplification is essential for control. Complex worlds produce questions. Divided worlds produce certainty. When people know clearly where they stand, they stop asking where the system stands. The category of us becomes associated with safety, morality, and legitimacy, while them becomes associated with danger, chaos, and threat. This association does not require constant evidence. It only requires repetition over time. Fear attaches itself to faces, accents, beliefs, and behaviors rather than actions. This is powerful because it transforms abstract control into emotional reaction. People no longer respond to policies, they respond to identity. The enemy does not need to act to remain dangerous. Their existence alone is enough. This allows the empire to maintain unity internally, because internal conflict is redirected outward. Frustration that might turn inward toward authority is instead aimed at the other. The psychology is elegant. Fear binds the group. Loyalty deepens. Suspicion becomes virtue. Questioning empathy becomes weakness. Once this division is established, moral rules shift. Actions that would be unacceptable within the group become justified against outsiders. Violence becomes protection. Exclusion becomes defense. Cruelty becomes necessity. The individual does not experience this as wrongdoing. They experience it as responsibility. To protect us is to act against them. Even silence becomes participation, because refusing to join the narrative risks being reassigned from us to them. This is how the boundary polices itself. The fear of crossing it keeps people aligned. Empires rely on this because it stabilizes identity. When the world is divided, belonging feels fragile and must be constantly proven. People demonstrate loyalty through language, through silence, through shared outrage. Even neutrality becomes suspicious. There is no safe middle ground because the system requires clarity. The US and them psychology also prevents solidarity across boundaries. People who share suffering cannot unite if they are trained to see each other as fundamentally different. This fragmentation protects the center of power while those at the edges blame one another. History shows this pattern repeating endlessly. Different empires, different enemies, same division. The labels change. Barbarian, infidel, heretic, foreigner, traitor, extremist. But the function remains identical. They mark who can be harmed without consequence. And once a group is placed outside, moral concern control becomes easier within. The final effect of this psychology is internalization. People begin to divide themselves. They police their own thoughts, wondering which side they belong to. Doubt becomes dangerous. Curiosity becomes risky. The individual learns to align instinctively because alignment feels like safety. The greatest strength of the US and them structure is that it does not need constant enforcement. People defend it passionately because it gives them identity, clarity, and belonging. And as long as people know who they are against, they rarely ask who benefits from the division. This is why empires invest so heavily in difference, because unity among the ruled is the only thing power truly fears, and division ensures that fear never becomes collective. Understanding this is unsettling because it reveals that hatred is often taught and loyalty is often engineered, and that the line between us and them is not discovered in reality. It is drawn deliberately where it is most useful for control. Silence is not emptiness, it is participation. When an empire reaches maturity, it no longer relies primarily on fear, belief, or division. It relies on something quieter: normalization. What was once shocking becomes familiar. What was once questioned becomes routine. What was once resisted becomes expected. This transition does not happen suddenly. It happens through silence. Small acts of compliance repeated daily. Words left unspoken, reactions withheld, questions postponed. Normalization is not imposed, it is learned. People adapt not because they agree, but because adaptation feels easier than resistance. Silence becomes the language of survival. At first, it is cautious. A person stays quiet to avoid trouble. Then it becomes practical. A person stays quiet to avoid inconvenience. Eventually, it becomes moral. A person stays quiet because speaking feels disruptive, immature, or unnecessary. At this stage, silence is no longer experienced as fear. It is experienced as common sense. This is how systems stabilize themselves, without needing constant enforcement, without visible repression. When everyone behaves as if something is normal, it becomes normal even if it is harmful, even if it contradicts lived reality. Normalization works by narrowing attention. People stop noticing what has always been there. Violence, injustice, inequality do not disappear. They fade into the background. Like noise in a city, they are no longer heard. Silence allows this fading because attention is a form of resistance, and when attention is withdrawn, power moves freely. In normalized systems, people do not ask, "Is this right?" They ask, "Is this how things are done?" The difference is subtle but decisive. Once behavior is framed as routine, moral evaluation shuts down. Individuals feel less responsible because they are doing nothing extraordinary. They are simply following the flow. Silence also spreads socially. People take cues from one another when no one speaks. Each person assumes others accept the situation. Doubt remains private, compliance becomes public. This creates the illusion of consensus, even when discomfort is widespread. History shows that many systems persisted, not because everyone believed in them, but because everyone believed everyone else did. Silence reinforces itself. It tells each individual that resistance is isolated and therefore futile. Normalization also reshapes memory. People forget that things were ever different. They grow up inside structures and assume they are natural, eternal, even necessary. The past becomes unimaginable, and without comparison, the present feels inevitable. This is one of the most effective forms of control, because it does not feel like control, it feels like reality. Silence protects this illusion. Speaking threatens it, because speech reintroduces contrast. It reminds people that what feels normal is constructed, and once something is seen as constructed, it can be questioned. This is why silence is rewarded, not always explicitly but socially. Those who remain quiet are considered reasonable, balanced, mature. Those who speak are seen as disruptive, excessive, or naive. The system does not need to punish dissent harshly. It only needs to frame it as unnecessary. Over time, people internalize this judgment. They silence themselves before others need to. Silence becomes self-maintenance and normalization completes its work. When a system reaches this stage, it does not require loyalty, it requires inertia. People move with it because stopping would require effort, awareness, and risk. The greatest strength of normalization is that it removes urgency. Nothing feels wrong enough. Nothing feels immediate enough. Nothing feels personal enough. Silence keeps life functioning while injustice persists. And this is the final refinement of power. Not the ability to force obedience, but the ability to make obedience invisible. To make silence feel neutral and to make questioning feel out of place. When silence and normalization merge, the system no longer needs to assert itself. It simply continues, and people live inside it, calling it normal life, unaware that what they have adapted to is exactly what once required explanation.